Well, I'll begin then with formal words of greeting. My name is Deena Aranoff, and I'm the director of the Richard S. Dinner Center for Jewish Studies here at the Graduate Theological Union. And along with the Center for Islamic Studies here, we jointly host a program called the Madrasa-Midrasha program. The director of that program is here today, Mahjabeen Dhala. Thank you, Mahjabeen, for your leadership and vision in this program. This is a particularly exciting public program because for 2 years, faculty from UC Berkeley and GTU have come together for monthly conversations about our intellectual interests, in many ways, our personal passions, and the ways in which the divisions that commonly break up conversations can be overcome in many ways through the facility of our research. That each person's research in many ways, I think, lays a foundation for the possibility of thinking through differences to come to understandings, not to come to sameness, but to come to more subtle understandings of religious cultures, histories, literatures, languages. So we decided that the last meeting of this faculty colloquium we would host as a public program, but we would host it in keeping with the vibe of the 2 years of conversation. So each person here will be hearing from Kamal Abu-Shamsieh, Daniel Boyarin, Sam Shankov, Mahjabeen Dhala, and myself. We'll share for around 5 to 8 minutes reflections about how their scholarship takes them beyond dichotomous thinking, binary arrangement of information, and into the mess of reality. And so we're very excited to hear from everybody. At the conclusion of these presentations, we'll be asking those of you here to put questions in the Q&A. We'll have conversations among ourselves, and then we'll conclude. I would like to thank the foundation support that has supported the Madrasa-Midrasha programming, the Walter Elise Haas Fund that has provided for the faculty to join us here, and of course for all of our programming. And I want to mention one upcoming program about which Mahjabeen knows I am very excited. We are hosting a 4-day summer institute in which participants will study Arabic and Hebrew, along with textual studies, calligraphy, and performative arts. The instructors include Dr. Ahmed Kater, who finished his GTU here, as well as Madeline Wise, Daniel, your student, who will be teaching as well, along with Rabbi Dorothy Richmond, Dr. Nomi Seidman, Rabbi Peretz Wolf Prasan. It's going to be a wonderful 4 days, and I hope you can join us in the summertime. So without further ado, we were joking earlier how to begin and what order to present. And there are so many typical, often dichotomous ways that Jewish culture, Islamic culture are organized in relation one to the other. And we decided to eschew all of those and to move alphabetically and have the order be determined by last name. So we'll begin with you, Dr. Kamal Abu-Shamsieh, the director of the interreligious chaplaincy program here at the GTU. We are very excited to hear from you in thinking beyond the binary.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Deena. I have to apologize in advance. My internet is spotty today, so if I got kicked out of this meeting, please continue. I'll join with you. And that's part of the binary. Either you are with us or are you without us. So when you start to think about binaries, we have to look beyond what's happening. In the field of chaplaincy, we think of binaries all the time as the beginning stage, something that we don't an area that we don't move beyond when we look at an area of living and dying. living and dying is one of the binary stages that we deal with in human relations. Either you are, for example, married or single, or with children or without. So we deal with the human element, and part of studying the living human document. So the binaries in the living human document is, a document normally is a dormant, it's without any living. So when you start what we believe in and we practice as the reflective practice part of the living human document, we infuse narratives into the binaries. We move beyond individualism into communalism. We live beyond what a person deal with without ignoring any of the elements of the narratives that she or he or all have. So with that, we look at the spaces in between. And that is what chaplaincy situated itself in. As an end-of-life chaplain, we deal with the living while dying. So there is a life that oftentimes suspended by everybody else, thinking that the person, okay, is no longer about to live or quality of life is low. So they basically ignore the person while they are living, but there is a lot of experiences and living in that stage. Oftentimes I see beyond the binary of living and dying, we see people who are transitioning, and that transition members who are joining, and I'll give an example of many people who move in to see relatives, and all of a sudden they say they are confused. They're with us, and all of a sudden they don't remember anything about us. And is the people are moving frequently from the world of this material world into the world of dreams. So they are in between what we call living and dying. They transition into the world of dreams. And that visit to grandma might happen while grandma is in the world of dreams. And to the person who's visiting is sometimes saying, I don't know how much she's getting out of it. That she's in today is the world of dreams or the world of the material world. And to her, really, it does not matter much. It does not matter if you're real or not. What matters is the experience and how they feel about it and the connections. Worship and dealings, ibadat and muamalat. So everything has to fit between either one of these two things. Either you deal with elements of revealed law that have to live and practice, or in areas of dealings among people. Yet the Quran oftentimes connects that that's not enough. Issues of faith has to deal with issues of practice. So you can start with faith, but you need to move on to practice. And practice, oftentimes people connect it with good practice. Yet the Quran talks about other elements of moving in and out of faith. There is a hadith that says an adulteress will not commit adultery while in the state of belief. So while in the state of having adultery, the person will move temporarily out of faith, and later on move into the realm of faith. So the issue of binaries has to remain with us as the grounding station that we resort to, whether you are awake or asleep. And in between, there is a lot of things happening. Prophet Abraham in the Quran questioned and asked God for a proof. He said, God, show me how you bring the dead out of, how to bring people out of the dead. And God said, you have not yet attained faith, or did not believe? He said, no, I believe, but I need my heart to be at peace. I need to have that state of peace that is, I have a lot of questions. So part of the binaries, we do have questions all the time, and we are seeking answers. And in the stage of seeking question and answer, we fall into the stage of the doubt. And doubt by itself is a theological concept that we believe in and we work on. And from that, we look at elements of religiosity and elements of spirituality, the connection between the two and the difference between both of them. In the hadith, and I would be brief here, so because I'm really looking for more of the question and answer and the engagement. The approach of the binaries in Islam, there is a hadith says, live this life as if you are a stranger or a wayfarer. And that's stage of binaries between settled in and not settled in. And that is how we look at living and dying, where we are living today with an eye on the hereafter. As a theological concept, we do everything in this life for rewards in the hereafter. And the hadith continues to say, and if you have lived for the morning, don't wait for the evening. And if you are living the evening, don't wait for the morning. In a way, is the binaries is about two stages that you're not in, but living the moment is the most important element as we are seeking clarity of the mind, seeking clarity of the heart. And Deena and all, thank you so much for having us. I'm looking forward to more of the discussion later on.
Thank you, Kamal. You've given us so much to think about. I hope, I want to invite everyone to take notes so that our discussion after hearing from everybody can really thread in and relate to everything that has been shared. But what a powerful binary to introduce to our conversation, the binary of living and dying. Well, I will go ahead. I did already introduce myself, and I'll go ahead and share a little bit how I've been getting beyond the binary in my own scholarship. So I think that actually it's interesting, but I notice my own mental tendency is I'm actually quite attracted to distinction making. And my students often call me out on it, that while I'm trying to complicate a picture, I really very often end up relying upon dichotomous thinking and differentiation in order to make various points. So I'm hoping maybe today that could be corrected for in some way. The binary that I've been working with the most, I would say, in my scholarship is the vernacular or the everyday living and religious or sacred, and to absolutely integrate those categories so that we don't really think, especially in approach to religion, and my focus is on Jewish culture, that we don't really think of classical sacred texts or even rituals of high ceremonial register as apart from everyday life and common custom, but actually to see it in a dialectical interplay with everyday life and vernacular formations. And in articulating this approach, I really draw very heavily from Galit Chazan Rokem, and I thank Daniel Boyarin, who's here today, for bringing Galit to Berkeley so often as you did. And her book that was published from the Taubman lecture series that she gave here, Tales from the Neighborhood, is a book in which Chazan Rokem really lays out this principle which is that rabbinic literature, the Talmud, there's a tendency, and here I'm quoting, there's a tendency in scholarship to overlook, quote, all other social institutions except for the academy and the synagogue. So there's a tendency to overlook the kind of social base of religious life in favor of the academy and the synagogue, end quote, when thinking about the creation of rabbinic texts. Instead, Chazan Rokem, I think rather poetically actually, suggests that, and I'll quote again, the discourse of the synagogue is created across its threshold. So rather than seeing the synagogue as apart from everyday life, rather than reading rabbinic renderings as apart from the vernacular realm of everyday living, to instead notice that even the formal, systematized religious texts, the discourse of the synagogue, in Chazan Rokem's language, is in fact created across its threshold. Another way that she puts it is that, quote, the wisdom of the rabbis is intertwined with the words of wise women. So there's an important feminist component to this approach, because given that the rabbinic elites were male, in assuming that rabbinic texts in fact are the product of a social phenomenon, then that also broadens the inputs to include women and to just diversify the elements that it constitute a rabbinic way of life. What I like to do in order to scramble these categories is actually to introduce the notion of the household as a way to think about religious culture without that binary of the academy or rabbinic, formations and everyday life. Because in the institution of the household, I think what you end up recovering by using that spatial term, highly materialistic institution, is you find a locus, or sometimes I like to say a matrix, because of the maternal valence of that term, from which is generated so many of the common practices that then are, I would suggest, belatedly systematized, recorded, and rendered in classical texts. In fact, if I could come back to Galit's phrasing, and I look forward to talking about this in our discussion time, I would even like for us to reconsider using the term synagogue as a metanym for rabbinic academic activity. Because I actually wonder whether the synagogue, certainly in late antiquity and before the modern period, I wonder whether we might want to think of the synagogue as something like a kind of extension of common households, that the synagogue itself is a vernacular place. There's a wonderful few lines in the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat where there's a rebuking of the general populace for their tendency to call the synagogue Beit Am, the place of the people. So you can see in that polemic that the Talmudic text even registers the fact that there are vernacular modes operating in the synagogue: hospitality, food, but even nomenclature. Women in that same passage in Tractate Shabbat are rebuked for calling the Aron HaKodesh, the ark, the sacred ark, Arna, the Aramaic for the ark. So you can feel the rabbinic, let's just call it academic voice, working against the vernacular as it's in fact shaping synagogue life. So I would like to move away actually from using synagogue as a shorthand for the elite renderings, and instead introduce, let's say, household as a useful term to think with, and maybe even a term that could apply to synagogue life, and therefore kind of make more visible the material functions of synagogue life in terms of the ways in which it's a part of Jewish street life, is maybe a way to put it. And in the little bit of time that I have left, I want to share one example, because why not, go dive a little bit deep, even in a short presentation, of the ways in which everyday life, household activity, can eventually generate rituals of high register. And I'll just throw out a kind of surprising example. How to give this briefly. So some of you may know that part of the tragic aspect of Jewish history in medieval Iberia is that there were many waves of forced conversions and even expulsion that resulted in there being a very large number of Jews who were baptized to Christianity, maintained a life in Iberia, and who retained certain practices, mostly having to do with household life. So this chapter of Jewish history, it turns out, affords access to the importance of household life in the making of distinctive Jewish culture, for the very tragic reason that many of these behaviors were then recorded by the Inquisition as part of persecuting people for these Judaizing heresies. But lest you think that the Inquisition was only interested in I almost want to call it iconic Jewish practices, refraining from leavened goods on Passover, lighting Sabbath candles. The Inquisitional records are actually filled with, I would argue, even more reliable accounts of somewhat idiosyncratic, specific aspects of household life, like food preparation, socializing, endogamy, visits in people's homes. And one of the most repeated Jewish behaviors to appear in Christian polemical literature from the era is a behavior called varer a casa as avesas, to sweep the dirt towards the inside of the house. This habit of sweeping towards the inside of the house, which is actually a very absurd behavior, given that it sends all the filth of the house indoors rather than outside the home, this became a kind of trope in anti-Jewish polemical literature. But what's interesting is that you will be very hard pressed to find any biblical or rabbinic basis for this custom. So how on earth did this become such a distinctive Jewish practice? And actually later, early modern rabbinic authorities do try to link that practice to, for example, reverence for the mezuzah, the biblical text that's posted on the doorway. Perhaps this converso custom was the result of that reverence for the sacred object at the doorway. But I would suggest that that is actually a rabbinic ex post facto attempt to tether this household, distinctive household practice to an object of high register. But instead, I would say, why not consider that the reason these people were sweeping their houses in the wrong way is because they were sweeping it on the wrong day. What we know from the Inquisitional records is that housework on Fridays was no less incriminating than abstention from work on the Sabbath itself. So if you change the lamp oil on the wrong day, or you're sweeping on the wrong day, or you're spinning thread on the wrong day, these are all signs that Jewish temporal structures are continuing to govern everyday life in the converso household. And ironically and tragically, these behaviors were recognized as Jewish in the Inquisitional records. So this is an example, and I'll conclude now, of the ways in which a distinction between household life and Jewish ritual is can obscure the very mechanisms by which distinctive cultural practices are generated. And yeah, I'll conclude with that. Thank you so much. And it is now my delight and honor to introduce Daniel Boyarin, who's thinking about rabbinic texts. I think that I owe to Daniel my biggest debt of gratitude for theorizing that field in such a way that has enabled for me a productive relationship with it. And not just for me, I would say at this point, 2 generations of Talmud scholars. So we're really very honored that you're joining us this morning to reflect with us about this binary. And I invite you now to please share. Thank you.
Thank you, Deena. Now I believe you can hear me, right? Yeah. I'm going to talk briefly, I hope. Usually, you know, Oscar Wilde said, "Forgive me for writing a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one." So I've been ill most of this week, and actually thought I wasn't going to come, but I'm feeling somewhat better, so I'm going to try my best to sketch in what I want to say, which is that having begun intellectual life as a structuralist and imagining the world entirely as composed of binaries, with the fundamental binary, the binary from which all binaries proceed, being the binary of male and female, I have progressed over the last 50 years. It is 50 years since I got my PhD. Over the last 50 years to a kind of systematic non-binarism. And the attempt to actually transgress and transcend all binaries. Of course, the greatest influence in that direction, or early influence, was Jacques Derrida, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing, who, through the invention of the procedure of deconstruction, enabled the ultimate transgression of binaries. I think the term deconstruction is thrown around nowadays for all sorts of things. A performance of Rigoletto that is set in Little Italy in 1930 is called a deconstructed production. But deconstruction originally and ideally still means taking a look at a commonly accepted binary and seeing how what shouldn't be on one side can be found on that side, what ought not to be on the other side can be found there, and that therefore the binary opposition itself is set in motion and transgressed through this process of deconstruction. So I won't go through all the list of binaries that I have ultimately felt that, having begun exploring, I have ultimately deconstructed, both in my mind, in my teaching, and frequently enough in my writing, and just focus on the latest iteration, which is the binary between religion and everything else. It is not a jeu d'esprit to claim that there is no religion, except insofar as we insist that there is, right? But that's true of all binaries. If we insist that there is an absolute binary between male and female, as much of the American South seems bound and determined to do, then there is that binary functioning, right? But nonetheless, we critique it with, right? So similarly, religion and non-religion. And I think this goes away in the direction of Deena's of Deena's argument, but perhaps even further. I like what I do like is being over the top as often as possible. Right? When you spill over the top, then the binaries disappear. The binary between the pot and the stove disappears when the soup boils over. Right? So, and that's so. So first of all, a couple of comments in this direction, and these are just going to be episodic comments, and then I'll stop. One, the synagogue is a vernacular place. It simply is, right? It's by definition, it's the place where people. It's Bet HaKnesset, where people gathered together. And if there is a binary to be discussed here, it's the binary between the synagogue and the Beit Midrash and the house of study, right? And if the synagogue is Bet Ha'am, the house of the people, the Beit Midrash is called Bei Rabbanan, the house of the sages. Now, but why is it called Bei Rabbanan? Because it's the place where sages eat and sleep and argue with each other and behave badly and behave well, right? So even there, the notion of a kind of binary sacralization is exploded from within. Secondly, the house of study is not an academic site, right? Because learning Torah is not an academic pursuit. In that track as well, and this I think opens up ways of new thinking about Jewish life in general, which I'm currently, that's my obsession. The Talmud and the study of Talmud is not itself an elite pursuit. It's a pursuit of the whole Jewish community. And this is no more an elite pursuit than incarnational theology is an elite pursuit in the 4th century in Christian circles, right? The famous saying that in Alexandria, the birds in the trees chirp about the consubstantiality of the Father to the Son, right? It is, I think, very much to the point, right? That these are, to be sure, practices of the mind, but even non-elites have minds, and there are obviously different and distinct modes of practice of study, but it is not, I would argue, the case that one is sacred and reserved and the others are not. Let me just continue my comparative metaphor for a moment. There are many ways in which the truths and arguments of Christian theology were communicated to the populace at large. famously through the art of the churches, and especially through the windows and the stained windows that communicate the distinct perspectives on the divine that characterize the fourth, fifth, and later and medieval churches as well. Secondly, through the poetry, liturgical poetry that was third, through the sermons. Similarly, I think in Yiddishkeit, or when I want to be explicitly non-Ashkenaz-centric, Judaite, right? I think French is the vernacular of non-Ashkenazic Jews. So by using a French term, I somehow, at any rate, displace Ashkenazocentrism. The language of the Talmud, the ways of thinking of the Talmud, why do Jews always answer a question with a question? Do we? Right? An expression like eating, I don't think I'll eat, but drinking, I'll drink a little, comes straight from the vernacular Aramaic of the Talmud. So much of the intonations of the soundscape of Jewish life are communicated through these speech patterns, these language patterns that come from the non-sacred Talmud. The Talmud is not a sacred book, right? It's a sacralized book to a great extent, but if we want to talk about a sacred book, there's only one sacred book, and that's the Torah, right? If it falls on the ground, we fast. If a Talmud falls on the ground, we pick it up and kiss it, right? I think that I'm done. I think that I've communicated at least the spirit of what I want to say, and I'm hoping that a perspective like this makes some small difference in the future of Jewish and ultimately the life of people in general. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. You've given us so much to think about. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that is to follow. And again, if you're just joining us, we're going to hear the full series of presentations first, and then discuss among the panelists and take questions and comments from those of you who are here in the Zoom room for discussion. So if we continue again with our alphabetical framing, then we get to hear now from Dr. Mahjabeen Dhala, Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies here at the Graduate Theological Union, and also the Director of the Madrasa-Midrasha program. Mahjabeen, I am very much looking forward to hearing your words now. I invite you please to share with us.
Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you, Deena, for bringing us together, for convening us in this quorum, and giving us the space to share, these binaries that we find ourselves navigating through our research and our training and our teaching. I think this has been such a wonderful start. We've started off with the states, the binaries, as they express themselves in a state of living and dying. You took us through the spaces, religious and vernacular, And then Daniel took us through this sphere of religious and everything else. So it's beautiful to see. And I think everything that you have all shared thus far has just gone to demonstrate that our work is problematizing the fixated nature of binaries, and sort of creating a space where the binaries are agitated, there are shifting of elements and perspectives, and just sort of dovetailing off of what Daniel just shared, that I think the religious, or how we construct or imagine or define or identify as religious, then actually governs everything else in our lives. So it is sort of the liminal space, the in-between, where all the learning and the discovery and the exploration takes place. So at least, for my work, and I think this is in general for all our works here, whether we are in Jewish studies or in Islamic studies, we are starting off with that binary of religious, secular, pious, secular. But my work in particular, I want to say, confronts the binaries of traditional and progressive. I find myself navigating the understanding, the epistemologies of what is traditional, what is progressive, how that is imagined, how that is translated into methodologies, and how that is appreciated as value and worth in academic research. So just a word of what I work on. I mean, my dissertation and hopefully my book is about the 7th century piece, which is the Sermon of Fatima. In itself embodies an agitation of so many binaries. There is a woman standing up to a man. There is a ageism, someone who is either 18 to 28 years of age, this woman, depending on what resources you dive into and build from, standing against a person who is in their late 50s or early 60s and a male. The binary of knowledge and experience. The woman is presenting a sermon which is a theological masterpiece of the post-prophetic era. Just 10 days after the prophet's passing, there is this oration, which includes a description of the transcendent nature of the deity, which includes a philosophical and Quranic expose in what is the role of a prophet as a teacher, as a spiritual guide, and a leader of bodies and nations. And she is talking about eschatology, and she is using the Quran to contest the usurpation of women's right to hold and possess lands. She's doing all this, which is studied, like I said, as a masterpiece of theological content, which is coming out from a woman's body in a female voice, standing against a man of elderly or the wisdom of the years and ages. So it's already agitating so many things. But what is particular to my context and my research is the growing dichotomy of faith and feminism, and really to the core of what is traditional and what is progressive. I remember when I first presented my doctoral thesis to my committee, and even among my peers, I was using language like social justice. I was using language like activism. And one of the first pushbacks that I received was that you are using this language, which is progressive language, Enlightenment language, and you are applying it to a pre-modern time, which is the 7th century. And that was one of my first encounters with navigating this binary. And it took me back to what is traditional and what is progressive. And in a minute, and I intend to stay within my time limit, in a minute, I'll try and bring this forward, that when you're looking at lived experiences, especially those of visible Muslim women of color, you are seeing that the progressive trend is emerging, but it's not really new. It is quite traditional. So it is emerging, but traditional. Well, for example, the value of critiquing is credited as a progressive value, to critique, to agitate the status quo, to act for change. But when you look at the Quran, you see that the prophetic mandate is exactly all of this. الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة. So the whole mandate is information is only good information in as much as it agitates the norm. And it agitates the norm to an extent where there is a reshuffling, a yuzakkiyim, exactly what Daniel was talking about, a reshuffling and relocating of those values and practices, until that leads to a transformation of what is wisdom and wise living. So when I present a paper which is passionate, sometimes a progressive remark is, this is opinionated. But I love the womanist perspective, and especially when it translates into the Black Lives Matter movement, that if it would be void of passion, it would not be impactful. So as a scholar in women's studies in Islam and Western academia, I find myself finding spaces of how can I be separate from my subject of study or distant from my subject of study to be able to satisfy the secular, authentic notion of critical thought. But at the same time, I find myself going back to the traditional values of information is not information unless it agitates. And it calls for a reshuffling of situations. So in my work, this is what I keep doing. And I believe this is my last minute where I want to say that I still find myself in this liminal space, which is too critical for a traditional table and too traditional for the secular feminist thought. And I think it directly impacts me, this construction of what is traditional and what is progressive. But through my work on pre-modern women, through the oral tradition, which embodied the activist role of these pre-modern women, I would love to think that I'm making a case towards studying lived experiences and oral traditions as contextual realities that embody a progressive attitude, which is quite traditional. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mahjabeen. Thank you for what you've offered here and such an integration, yes, of commitments and passions of the moment and their role in our scholarship. And so I know many are here wanting to comment further, and we'll have that opportunity for discussion after we hear from everyone. Again, moving along in our alphabetical order, we will now get to hear from Dr. Sam Shankov, also a professor along with me at the Center for Jewish Studies here at the GTU. Sam, we're very excited to hear from you today.
Thanks so much, Deena, and to everyone here. It's been such a joy to listen so far, and I'll see if I can hopefully further enrich this really rich landscape that we're cultivating here. So the binary that I want to talk about that's really from the project on the front burner right now, and an article that I'm working on right now, is the binary of remembering and forgetting. This binary of what it means to remember versus forget is something that is really caked quite foundationally into rabbinic, classical rabbinic thought, in the sense of especially remembering Torah versus forgetting Torah, whatever that means exactly. And this, we could also formulate this sort of alternatively as a binary between knowing and not knowing. You know, do you have knowledge or do you lack knowledge, or did you lose that knowledge, or did you fail to acquire that knowledge? Did it somehow slip through along the way? And especially in looking at some work in Hasidism, in an early modern Eastern European born Jewish mystical movement, this binary that is quite traditional of remembering versus forgetting is subverted in ways that I find super interesting. So I would say that this particular blurring of the binary is indeed counter-traditional in the ways that we see it in Hasidic spirituality. And I'm looking at this also in terms of perspectives on what it is to be a child versus to be an adult, to be an infant versus to be all grown up, right? There's like in this path from not knowing to knowing, from a place of forgetfulness to remembering, is also a this is a scheme of human development. So in the classic rabbinic imagination, it's also drawing upon its Greek context, but this is imagined in the form of an image of a fetus knowing all of Torah, and then being made to forget it upon birth. And then that makes the rest of life a process of learning, of remembering Torah. And so the more adult you are, and of course this is gendered traditionally, I would say, like in this classical rabbinic process, that the more adult the person is, the more they remember, the more they know. And so we see there are some images of like uncanny infants who, like, it's in Jewish mysticism, in medieval Kabbalah, we have the Yanuka of the Zohar, the suckling one, the baby, the infant, the young child, who is sort of uncannily precocious in his knowledge of Torah. But that is, in some ways, the fact that he's a baby who has this immense theological, cultural knowledge is striking in this context for the same reason that, say, a talking donkey is striking, right? It's not saying something about the baby, about the child, about not knowing that is itself meaningful or profound in some way. It's still, the focus is on, do you know? Do you remember? Do you have knowledge? This really changes in the Hasidic context. And so what this paper I'm writing right now is looking at a kind of romanticizing of child mind, of being infantile in some sense, as an end in itself, that place of actually not knowing, of being a blank slate, as it were, of not yet re-remembering Torah as itself a spiritually, theologically fertile zone to be in, where actually the adult who might aspire to such a baby likeness, right, to such a child likeness, is actually in forgetting what they know, is actually recovering something, is actually remembering something. So some of the the very early expressions of this, and why this happens historically in the late 18th century is a question that interests me, that is part of this project that I'm not going to go into now, but could talk about it later maybe. So we have teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, who's sort of understood to be the founder of Hasidism, so to speak, says that, for example, when you're in a state of constricted consciousness, when you're being flooded with machshavot zarot, of kind of invasive thoughts in prayer, in order to sort of reground yourself, he says, "Azayit palel ketinok ben yomo mitoch hakatav," right? Go back to looking at just the letters in the prayer book as if you're a day-old baby, right? Reground in that place. And in interpreting a line from Psalms, "Al tashlecheni le'et zikna," don't cast me off in a state of old age. The Baal Shem Tov very famously kind of reinterprets this as, don't cast me off into a time of oldness. Don't be old, right? This is a subversion. So it's not a romanticizing of the elder, of the sage. It's actually a saying, don't go there. Like, stay young. And of course, he doesn't mean, this isn't ageism, right? This is not actually a comment about not respecting or appreciating elders. It's actually a vision of how can you be an elder who is also infantile. That is like the new spiritual ideal. And this comes really explicitly and vividly to the fore in a great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, Rebbe Nachman of Bratslav, who actually, in one of his well-known tales, he was a master storyteller, especially when he was approaching death himself. He has this character, this really enigmatic character that enters one of his tales, the seventh beggar. He's a blind man who says about himself, "I'm very old and still totally infantile." Tinok legamre. He says, "I am very old and still totally infantile. I have not yet started to live at all, but nonetheless, I'm very old." And this is clearly this character, this persona, is a reflection of something Rebbe Nachman himself is aspiring to in his own teaching, in his own life, that his students comment on repeatedly, that periodically, even after speaking some elaborate, like eye-popping revelatory piece of Torah, Rebbe Nachman would go into this place of just repeating, "I don't know anything. I don't know," like he would say, like in the most emphatic terms, "I know absolutely nothing." He says, "I don't even know how to be a Jew," right? And his students interpret this to say that Rebbe Nachman, as a practice, is emptying out, right? He is entering a stage, process of forgetting, intentionally or unintentionally, a state of total forgetting, in order to return to a place that is infantile, that is new, that is what we might call a sort of beginner's mind, to then enter into new kinds of revelation. And a lot of this article is looking at ways that his main, his sort of most famous student, Reb Nasson, interprets this, what it means to be like a child, to be like a baby, to enter this place where you converge oldness and infantileness in a state of oneness, and to be in that place where forgetting, right, not knowing anything anymore, opens up new possibilities and new pathways for a kind of recovery and remembering of what is spiritually, theologically foundational, to then reapproach, right? To then reapproach the tradition from a place of that infantile forgetfulness or lack of knowing, to then illuminate the landscape in wholly new ways. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sam. Yet another amazing framework for thinking with remember, forget, or knowing and not knowing. Thank you for that, and bringing in Hasidic materials. So I just to say, when you said the landscape, we're populating it with so many evocative concepts and terms. So looking forward to the discussion. Thank you. We now get to hear from Nargis Virani. Nargis Ali Virani is joining us from far away. You will tell us where you are, I hope. And Nargis has been a scholar in residence at the Center for Islamic Studies for many years, teaching here at the GTU, along with the language instruction that she offers, and also with always a focus on language translation in the poetry of Rumi. Nargis, and yes, please, I invite you to share your thoughts on the binaries that can organize our thinking, but if I could use Daniel's image of just letting that pot boil over and really opening up the everything that is in between those dichotomous ways of thinking.
Thank you, Deena. I'm sorry I can't do anything about the background noise where I am. This is my third try to actually log on to Zoom. There are many sites that I cannot log on to from where I am. I am in Iran right now, and in Kashan, and therefore I wasn't even sure if I could join in with Zoom. And then, of course, the internet was difficult in most places. So I'm sorry. I'm in a coffee shop, and if the noise in the background, is there, you'll have to just live with it, because this is my best bet in terms of not getting cut out. So I apologize for that. It's a pleasure to join. And the binaries, each of your presentations. Sorry, Deena, I missed, how much time do we have?
Yes, you between 8 to 10 minutes, Nargis,
Okay.
and your sound is just fine. So carry on.
Great. Okay, that helps. So the binary, Sam, the binary of remembering and forgetting. I worked often, as Deena mentioned, with Rumi's poetry and the paradoxical language of mystical thought in all of our faiths are constantly dealing with those kind of binaries, right? You're alive and you're dead. And when you're dead, you'll be alive. But you think you're alive, but really you are dead. That kind of language is so reminiscent of that. And I've often talked about different binaries, but today I want to share with you something that has preoccupied me in the 2 years of COVID. And again, it has to do with my interest in language. But this has to do with a larger Shiite community after the 12 Shiites, which is the Nizari Ismaili community. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, within a month of the pandemic, the entire community, as most of us did, the programs went online for universities. This community started doing a lot of their, all kinds of programming to support people during the pandemic, and doing a lot of sort of therapeutic work online, including talks that I gave on the Quran. But within a month of that, they actually launched a 24/7 Ismaili TV, which is now accessible to everyone around the world for the last year and a half or more, almost 2 now. And so by and large, this is a community that's a minority community, minority of the Shiites, and have shied away from being very public. And here you have a very public website, the.Ismaili TV, which is a 24/7 programming from about 25 different countries in 8 or 10 time zones. And what does that do in terms of a community thinking about what its identity is and what does it mean, where you have a conceptual and a cognitive understanding of you being part of a transnational community. And once in a while, you may see some people from different part of the world who profess your faith, but speak a different language, come from a different culture.
Right.
Now you're actually seeing it all together. Not only that, but many young people, particularly during festive days, like the two Eids and Laylatul Qadr during Ramadan, there is special programming. Nowruz, for example, that a lot of Persian and Persianized communities celebrate, the Ismailis do. So on all of these big occasions, including their present living Imam's birthday and his accession to Imamat, there'll be special programs. And my interest has been in looking at these devotional songs that are part of this tradition, but now are increasingly composed by very young people, because by virtue of the fact that you're online, you need, the tech-savvy people. And you can't do with the oldies, right? So these people, and of course, volunteerism in all Shiite communities is a huge deal, and Mahjabeen, of course, does, and I volunteer. But you suddenly see a huge number of young people who are setting up these programs, who are running it. It's an entirely volunteer system of 24/7 TV. And people volunteer their time, their resources, their knowledge, their technique. And of course, it's leveled the field in many ways. So you could have a preacher, a theologian, a scholar from one part speaking to their part. Now, I have a global audience, but the global audience also has multiple scholars, multiple preachers in multiple languages. So anybody in the US who are aesthetically inclined to hear sermons in Urdu or Hindi or Gujarati, even for purely sort of nostalgic reasons, can now hear that from a preacher on live Ismaili TV. And they just, every 6 hours, it's the same program that's repeating because of the time zones. So you're on it. I think that it's fascinating, and it's very raw work. I want to look at the devotional songs. And now what you do have is collaboration of very young artists. It's multi-generational, but a lot of very young talent coming in and writing their songs, performing musical instruments. And you see this, group of people doing this time and again, now collaborating. A young person in Seattle is collaborating with someone in Korog, and a third person in England, and a fourth person in Spain. And they are composing songs that are English, German, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, all in one. So, my obsession with macaronic verses of Rumi, now I see that very much alive. And I am at that stage when I'm thinking about, on the one hand, these are not binaries. On the other hand, there is a binary there of a transnational community that's coming together on one platform and looking at its own identity in very many different ways. And my interest being language, I'm going to look at that language of the devotional songs. And how is that being composed in terms of Shiite sensibilities? And also eventually then looking at, on the one hand, you try and see that language is very inclusive, even if it might be sloganizing, because very few people understand any of this, but they communicate with each other. So there is a certain sense of performance with great, on the one hand, rhetoric, but also great, emotion. And at the same time, the binary that I come across is the binary of, will this mean, one of the things, sorry, I'm going to go back. There's so much noise. I'm glad you're not hearing it. But so there is, on the one hand, their imam is constantly talking about and has prepared them for this eventuality of the communication and transportation becoming, so fast that they will eventually face this. So the idea of a plurality, the idea of respect for pluralism, the idea of respect for diversity, whereas one community in their own enclave may think that they are more legitimate and their devotional songs or their hymns in their language have greater authority than somebody sitting out there. There is this thing about coming together, but the binary that I'm trying to address is the fact that on the one hand, a transnational community has got an opportunity to see for real what does it mean to be transnational, but will it also go the same route that globalization has gone, which is actually wiping out the diversity within there. So there might be a new language that is emerging, but would that mean the McDonaldization of the world and the jeans that all the Iranian young men and women are wearing around here that are exactly the same that your daughter and my daughter wear back home, right? So in that sense, that preserving of that anchoring and diversity, would that be wiped out? Now I see one example that I want to give is the actual aesthetics of the decor in homes. I have a very blank screen at the back, but there are no blank screens. This is my third attempt, as I said. Usually the aesthetics of the home decor and architecturally and the blues, they're all over Iran. It's very difficult to find a blank wall. Here, when these artists are performing, they're performing in their own homes, they're collaborating on a screen like this. Each one has this decor. The aesthetic sense has also changed. There is a melange of that decor, and suddenly you see a Central Asian, product appearing. Books are displayed in a certain manner. Home decor and all kinds of things are, tea trays are displayed in a certain way. And suddenly I might feel as one of the performers, I have a really blank wall. Next time I do this, I'm going to have, similar decor. So in terms of the aesthetics, are those aesthetics changing, and are they changing for a greater inclusivity and exchange, or are they changing for a flattening? And that's a question I have, and all of you who have any wisdom in this part. This is completely new, contemporary for me, but I've been fascinated by this 24/7 TV for a religious community and what that means. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I didn't go over my time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nargis. Thank you for bringing us into the contemporary cultural moment and the rapid change, and to use the word Mahjabeen kept coming to, the agitation of the status quo that's happening in media and in language, and also naming the dangers of in the trajectories that are underway. So thank you. So I want to take this moment just to thank everybody here again for their presentations, and to invite the participants in our Zoom room to post questions or comments that I'll do my best to kind of curate a bit and then bring to the panelists, to everybody here. But as that is underway, I would like to open this up. Wow, we actually only have 10 minutes for comments and questions. So let's begin the conversation amongst ourselves. We began with Kamal, and it's interesting, each person did introduce a very distinctive kind of binary or set of terms to think with, but they related one with the other so powerfully. Would anybody like to jump in on the relationships they see or questions that they had as we were listening?
Well, I want to connect what Daniel mentioned with what Sam brilliantly brought together, which is the concept of deconstruction that Daniel brought with the concept of forgetting to remembering, or remembering forgetting to remembering to forgetting again, which is something in practical theology, I look at it as the revised correlation, which is in somehow the construction or what we have as a reservoir of knowledge, what we've been inherited, what we've been given, which is in some way is the law itself. When you mentioned the most sacred book is the Torah, the most sacred book to me is in the Quran, it's in the law that is being presented. Then when we look at the context of the challenges that we find ourselves in it, we go back to the law, which is we forget what we have to go to what we remember of what defines us, what informs us of sacred texts. Then we start the concept of deconstructing that text and our knowledge to bring about a different interpretation, to bring about a different response, prophetic response to that. So in that way, we forget what we have to remembering, and we back to forgetting, because in that process, we're always challenged with a set of legal and ethical challenges that we will be encountering, such as, is what we did kosher? Is this really acceptable? Is this sacrilegious what we've done? Is it a changing of that sacredness in the text and in our own understanding? And that process of construction, deconstruction, forgetting to remembering is what we look at, that literally the wisdom that we bring into, or practical reason what bring into the process to bring or to infuse life in the text that we have. So thank you both for bringing those two concepts together.
I appreciate that reference to text and what Deena put in the chat about hermeneutics of the sort of the text coming apart and coming back together. And one of the sort of hermeneutical exegetical flourishes that so often enters this discourse that I'm looking at is this idea of looking upon Torah and looking upon scripture as if it were given today, which is an old midrashic formulation, but to read the Hayom, on this day, today, so to look at it with fresh eyes, as it were, to open up new interpretations, which has this arguably a deconstructive potential to it, but for purposes of constructing something new that will then be a castle in the sand once again. I have a question. I don't know. Maybe it's too big of a question, but I'm listening to all of these. I was just thinking, like, of the social, ethical, political, theological value of interrogating these binaries, of deconstructing these binaries, while at the same time observing within myself a resistance at a certain point. I was much more into deconstructing all binaries before the Trump era, right? And I think about, like, what does it mean to, on one hand, vigilantly critique all of these sort of binary dichotomy ways of sort of breaking apart reality in the world, while also maintaining clear, robust binaries of truth and falsity, of righteousness versus corruption, right? Of goodness versus evil, and how to hold both of those. And perhaps the deconstructing of binaries can be in service of the maintenance and deepening of other kinds of binaries that are essential, I think, for ethical life. But I'm just curious how others think about that relationship.
I think that's a great question, and I really haven't thought about this much in advance, but I'm just speaking freely that I wonder whether even in the work to protect human rights, to ensure human rights, to stop violations and violence, I still wonder whether the shorthand of dichotomous and binary oppositional language does harm to the effort, and that the work of remaining in a descriptive mode without recourse to the shorthand will bear more fruit. I don't know.
I think in terms of efficacy, perhaps what you're suggesting, Deena, may be a more efficient and smart way to go about it in terms of changes. But questioning, recognizing binaries and questioning them, is as much part of the growth, right? If you don't, because there is that agitation. There are things that don't fit in a scholarly endeavor. There are fields that have been charted out and they don't fit, and one tries very hard in graduate school to do that. And when one becomes more or less a little bit more independent of the fields and the dissertation advisors, and later you still need to ground yourself in some ways. But I have no doubt that in terms of efficacy, the more sort of pragmatic way to go about it is how do you work with some, and how do you push those boundaries? And I think that many of the Muslim feminists in their work, academic work and work within the community, I think Mahjabeen and myself, we both somehow work within those boundaries, and at the same time are able to slightly push and perhaps, and Mahjabeen, I don't want to speak for you, but perhaps taste that as the fruit of it, whilst you see something moving, which again in your description of the binary is you're two traditionalists, you're perceived as two traditionalists, by the academic sort of academe, and too progressive by the community. And I think the job within that community is to see those baby steps that are taken. The fact that women do lead things and do things and are able to change. And the fact that many men are able to accept that, that's like a huge change. But those kind of changes within the communities do not come without working within that framework. Otherwise it would destroy or paths to working and making any change whatsoever.
Thank you, Nargis. Thank you so much. We just have another minute or two. Any last reflections or comments?
I'm wondering if I could just chime in there. We're talking about remembering, forgetting, change, agitation, and I want to sort of build off something that Ibi said and what Nargis said earlier in the chat here, and that is growth. So I think in our work of the poles, the different extremes, and then the space between, even if everything just came in between, I think we would lose our opportunity for discovery and growth. So just the natural state of being human and deploying the intellectual and the emotional within the human being, there will be these shifting values all the time. And even if we found a mean, there will be some values that then expand to the dichotomous positions. And I think this is what the cycle, I'm going to lift up what Ibi Shahabuddin said here, that is the cycle, I think. And with the complexities comes the discovery and then that impetus for renewed change. So there are efficient things, and then there are these enchanting opportunities for discovery and change as well as we navigate these binaries. I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Mahjabeen. And I think that I will now kind of offer goodbye and blessings for a good summer, and be healthy, be well, and may these agitations in our scholarship bring the fruit of understanding, of mutual understanding and cooperation.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. All right, be
Thank
well,
you all.
everyone.
Great summer,
Thank you for
everybody.
joining us.
Thanks.
Safe travels, Nargis.
Thank you, Mahjabeen. I'll be in touch. Bye-bye.